This book makes my back and my ribs hurt a lot. I'm not going to talk specifically about the book itself. Quite an amazing book, a real life recount of what Paul Kalanithi went through as he's dealing with his terminal cancer diagnosis. Despite being a very short read, I had to put it down very, very often because of the physical discomfort I kept feeling. At one point, the discomfort got so bad, I honestly thought I had to go back to the hospital or something. About a little more than a year ago, I got hit by a car and I had some really grotesque injuries to my ribs, my lungs, and my back. This area just kept getting injured over and over again. When I read this book, it just kept reminding me of that time of despair and confusion I felt at the time, not knowing how much I could recover, knowing if I could recover. I felt that every time I picked up the book. It was weird, yet I wanted to keep bringing myself back. It took me months to finish, but I finally finished this book. It might be mirrored, so it's a great book. I think a lot of people probably feel this strong pull for it. What I wanted to focus on was the theme of how we relate to physical pain, meaning, and what's happening to all of us. Are we all right? Are we alright? Seeing something completely, seeing it fully, 100% embracing it, the will to want that even in the most desperate of times. I think that's what Paul's story reminds me of. Reading the book, he seemed like the type of person that wants to maximize his potential and strive for something that's deeper than just me. There are a lot of themes in this autobiography of Paul talking about what it really means to suffer. Themes I found myself really pulled towards, and I wanted to kind of rationalize it according to my own philosophy. Where does beauty and grace come from? When Paul is talking about his childhood, he alludes to the book A Brave New World. This book is like 100 years old, so if you haven't read it, I'll just briefly spoil it. The basic message of the book, I think, is that life is worth living because of its hardships. Without embracing hardship, in this dystopian world of Brave New World, people become distracted by things like drug uses, sex, and pleasure. The author wrote the book in this manner to show how much beauty there could be in life and how much beauty is ruined when we seek pleasurable distractions. So there is no sense of art or grace and no sense of meaning. The book actually ends very violently with an indigenous person that cannot cope with the way the world is structured around him and with how inhumanely they treat him. In the end, he would purposefully abstain from things like lust. He would never take the soma drug, which is very popular in the book, to punish himself for his cravings and the lust that he felt for one of the girls in the book. He would often participate in self-punishment through whipping himself. The book eventually ends with him committing suicide after people in the city consistently harass him for the way he's living. It really is a powerful commentary on trying to understand what makes life tick and what makes it matter. I think both in this book and in the book When Breath Becomes Air, the question of what it means to nobly suffer is very much posed. A big part of Paul's struggle was also grappling with the fact of the sheer coldness of the scientific world. He talks about how as he's dying, he began to read more about the Bible, and rather than necessarily leaning on its literal truths, he found a lot of meaning in its metaphorical truths. Truth, he said, was an asymptotic line, math, that's getting closer and closer and closer to the real thing, but never quite hitting it. Like all of us are somewhat guessing what truth means. We're all approaching it from a different angle, but we could never truly see the full picture, Paul says. And I think that aspect of seeking that truth and seeing clearly is also where beauty and grace comes from. Because we could never truly, completely stabilize it or understand it, that striving can make us suffer. So what made me feel pain while I was reading this book? And why did I continue reading it? I do think that pain is not completely synonymous with suffering. Truth is somewhat approximation in words, but all in all, a lot of it's just a language barrier type of game that we can't truly communicate with each other. But Paul wrote the book in such a way that we could experience it. We could really feel what that striving was like. I think a lot of people probably understood where he was coming from, even if they're not going through the same thing, which is a mark of a great writer. Is there a difference between dying with a small d and dying with a big D? Difference between dying of old age or dying from a really big heavy hitting thing like an accident or a terminal disease? I do think there's a difference, and the main one is the fact that it's so much more in your face. It's hard to forget your mortality, something like as serious as cancer, versus something like old age. Younger people could really completely distract themselves from it, especially if we don't want to pay attention to it. We don't want to see that out. As we get older, we're going to wither up, our skin's going to get dry, our balls are going to shrink, your finger will get crusty, and eventually she will leave you. Our clinginess to those distractions really does make it hard for us to fully accept what dying is like. I was trying to grapple the idea of detachment with the Sisyphus myth. The whole idea of taking the burden and continuously pushing the rock forward no matter what. It's basically taking the burden for the sake of the burden, no matter what the end result is. Sisyphus' story, the rock is continuously falling down, and he has to keep pushing it up over and over and over again, voluntarily accepting suffering so that it becomes a beautiful thing rather than something that you avoid. I think when Paul was re-entering his doctor field and doing more surgeries in the future, he was kind of talking about a similar idea. He chose to re-enter the neurosurgery field despite the fact that it was hard, despite the fact that it was harder on his recovery. It gave him meaning and a sense of purpose. and a sense of nobleness to his suffering. And that was an incredibly inspiring and amazing part of the book. It really was. And I've been trying to reconcile that idea of striving for hard things with the idea that suffering is a choice at almost every moment. And now I'm really just talking about my own personal things. And to me, I'm always grapple with the question, is it ever really noble to suffer? And I think what I came up with was this. For people striving to do hard things, to do things purely for the sake of meaning, they are not suffering when that thing is being done. There's a lot of pleasure that comes from lifting that rock over and over again. The sense of purpose we feel when we act this way, in my opinion, is also an act of pleasure chasing, albeit a much better one. But what about when you're told you can't do that act that you have gotten so accustomed to finding meaning from? Or what if in your headspace you don't even know what the rock it is that you're supposed to be pushing? What if there's confusion in your mind? You know that pain you feel when you're confused and frustrated and you don't know what to obsess over? You don't know what in the end is worth suffering over? I think that sense of confusion and clarity is probably what's meant by suffering for me. It's the craving that you just cannot fulfill. That to me is suffering. It's not necessarily doing hard things. It's the craving that you just cannot fulfill. And like I said before, a lot of this is a language thing. I'm comparing like 4 different books to each other. From what I see, Paul is a perfect example of what it means to do it in a noble way, because what he's doing is driving vigor in himself, and when he's told he can't become a surgeon, he finds a different outlet, and that's how this book is born. This book is born to the love of literature that he's always had, and he was write it because he couldn't do his practice anymore. He didn't exactly know what the end of his diagnosis looked like and what time frame he had. So it really made me think in my own life, what is worth suffering for? If I have to pick, then what is worth suffering for? And I still came to the conclusion that while pain is inevitable, every suffering that I choose is a choice, albeit my free will video says it's not. But what I mean is that confusion and unclarity of mind is not a necessity. I think it's possible to have a beautiful and graceful and life filled with meaning when I have a mind that is clear and can see. Striving for a worthy goal, striving for a worthy career, a meaning, striving for love and happiness in the world only comes when I first have that. And it sounds a little bit paradoxical, but it makes sense to me. You can only really attract those sense of joy and meaning when you already learn how to be joyful and find happiness in what you already have. It's pretty paradoxical, and I don't know exactly what I'm saying. That's why a lot of these things is more like a poetry. It's more felt rather than preached. And I hope I don't come across as being preachy. Ultimately though, what I'm saying is that when we accept the changing nature of pain and pleasure and our attachments, it will automatically help us embrace what is meaningful. There are times when we are forced to carry the rock up over and over and over again with no end sight in mind, but there are also times when we don't know what rock to carry, and that striving is fine if you really want to. That's not the way life needs to be lived. And this dance and this struggle with what we choose to strive for is part of what makes all the greatest art. The ones that we gravitate towards remind us of what we forget at any moment. We are dying and we will distract ourselves from it. Drugs, career, meaning, and while I don't think we could ever fully realize the capital T truth, I guess, we could always come closer to it, and that might be worth suffering for. I started this video by talking about how this book, Breath Becomes Air, made me feel physical pain. At the same time, I also was reading the Percy Jackson series, where the idea of an Achilles heel is brought up. I think the idea behind the Achilles heel is that everything has a cost to an extent. Achilles is supposed to be the greatest warrior of all time, completely invulnerable. That strength comes from one major weakness, spot in his heels. His heels are actually more vulnerable than anyone else's. His end came with an arrow to that heel. The Achilles tendon is considered to be the strongest joint of all of us. Yet, it is also the same exact thing that could completely ruin us. Ruin our basketball careers, ruin our athletic careers. So I wonder if that pain that I felt in my ribs and my back was actually kind of like my Achilles heel. A reminder of my mortality, a reminder of my vulnerability, done in a physical, visceral way. That cost to benefit analysis, the one where having something great could mean something that you have something weaker, meaning is more of a verb rather than like a noun. It's something that's constantly developing rather than something that you have. And if we are agreeing to the whole like, I must do this, then I will be this, and it automatically causes a cost in us. A cost which is like, I cannot be satisfied until I get that thing. And that by definition is suffering. If we have to pick those wants that carefully, then I want to make sure that the one that I pick is just worth suffering for. Okay. So that wasn't really a book review, nor was it really that deeply philosophical. It was more of a reflection. But I think this quote in the end of this book particularly really encapsulated what it means to me to live a good life. Towards the very last paragraph of the book, as Paul is very sure of his prognosis, he writes this to his daughter, who isn't yet old enough to understand what's happening. He says this: "The message is simple. When you come to one of the many moments in life where you must give an account of yourself, provide a ledger of what you have been and done and meant to the world. Do not, I pray, discount that you filled the dying man's days with a sated joy, a joy unknown to me in all my prior years. A joy that does not hunger for more and more, but rests satisfied in this time right now." That is an enormous thing. Paul Kalanithi. That quote pretty much summarized to me what it feels like to live a good life.